stories that are both a delight to read and to hear. Kids I know. Red hair and freckles with emerald green eyes are considered beautiful and rare. Jane would just prefer not having everyone stare. Jane would rather feel plain, not always be stared at this way. Everyone comments about it all day. They say, "Oh, what lovely red hair! Look at those green eyes!" "Thank you," she politely replies. They tell her, "Freckles come from tiny fairy feet, walking across your face when you sleep." They also insist that her red hair means she has a fiery temper and her eyes may change color with the daily weather. It's all starting to make her annoyed and glum. This fuss and attention are no longer fun. She's embarrassed by almost everyone that she knows. It's good they don't know that her feet have 6 toes. Harrietta was hardly ever misunderstood. She would practice her flute and was really quite good. Then something changed, made her nerves stand on end. She became afraid of sharp noises and her mumbling began to offend. She would always sit down at the front of the band while all around her the others would stand. Sitting below the loud horns and beside the biggest drum, for earplugs she used 2 sticks of gum. She was battered and bruised from the sounds the band made. It was something expected from their 7th grade. They played furiously for hours at a time, and how they played could be called a crime. The audience would always be polite and clapped. No one heard a thing when Harrietta finally snapped. Pete's right hand is his left, and his left hand is his right. It is certainly seen as an awkward sight. I know this all sounds very odd, but he always makes the school's basketball squad. His teammates will say, "His thumbs don't ever get in the way." He never pokes himself in the eye. I don't think he could, even if he tried. He does handstands better than anyone else and has no troubles reaching the tallest shelves. All his gloves still fit, and Pete can pitch, catch, and bat baseballs better than some want to admit. There's not a single problem that he's found. He believes that everyone should have their hands switched round. It may not be so odd about Pete. I've heard of some people having 2 left feet. Millie looked like Jen, and Jen looked like Millie. They were both twin sisters, so that may not have been very silly, except that Millie's twin sister was really Holly, and Jen's twin sister was really Fran. But both Holly and Fran looked more like Anne. You can't imagine the confusion in class each day. Anne's sister was really Kay, and Kay didn't look like anyone else. She only looked like herself. There was confusion when the school pictures were taken. Things were mistaken. It's what you'd expect. Nothing turned out correct. Jen's picture was confused with Millie's. Fran's picture was confused with Holly's. Kay was away from school that day when all the pictures began, although there's a picture of Kay that looks a lot like Anne. When the mean bullies came, everyone else ran away. Only Todd Barry stood his ground. That's what they say. He stood there bravely, it would appear, but he really didn't know that any threat was near. He's not braver than any other little kid. If he'd seen those big bullies, he also would have ran and hid. He's very nearsighted and didn't see those bullies that day. All the noise and the fuss he just thought was some fun group play. He stood there quietly and just kept staring in his most unusual way. While others ran to hide in fear, he just stood there as those bullies came near. Soon the bullies all became afraid of this little kid from the 6th grade. It was like a nightmare, the way he dared and glared, the way he stared was so very odd. The bullies all ran away from Todd. He seemed so brave to both Louise and Mary. Their school pictures were taken beside their hero, Todd Barry. Kate's body was a bit too small for her head, or maybe her head was too big instead. There was no problem and no one to blame, but all the other kids still stared just the same. You know how it starts and how some kids can be. One said, "Her head is too big," and another simply agreed. "If you stand just right, it could give you a fright. Her toes stay dry when she stands in the rain. With a head that big, she must have a great big brain. All her teachers know she's very smart. Everyone likes her from the start, and her brain still isn't as big as her heart. Really, all her friends think she's great. Besides, her sister's head is much bigger than Kate's." Dan wore a different T-shirt to school each day. He just liked goofing around in that way. His T-shirts had pictures of anything. There were turkeys on Thanksgiving, jack-o'-lanterns on Halloween. I'm sure you know what I mean. There were even T-shirts with colors, stripes, and dots. Whenever he spilled, it just added more spots. Every day a new T-shirt, but something else began. There was something else strange about Dan. He started growing more round and plump. He started looking like a great big Dan lump. It wasn't clear exactly why, not until he started turning blue right before our eyes. He never took off his old T-shirts and kept adding a new one each day, but he always changed his underwear. That's what his classmates would say. People said, "He has a green thumb." There wasn't any doubt, but still nothing Mike Dingle ever planted would sprout. He sowed carrots in a nice neat row, although in the end nothing would grow. When he planted corn, everything seemed fine to Mike Dingle. When he planted beets, his thumb started to tingle. His hands were often dirty and his thumb was never clean. When he planted parsnips, his thumb seemed a bit green. When he planted potatoes, his thumb started to swell. When he planted asparagus, it even started to smell. That's when it started to feel a bit numb. So he then went to a doctor about that green thumb. Still, it was always true that nothing he planted ever grew. Brad made very little noise, always spoke in a quiet voice, and didn't have any toys. He lived with his grandfather, who wore a tinfoil hat. Brad often sat in a favorite chair and just patted Matt, their big fat cat. He would always say that the room seems cold and started acting like he's very old. He would walk slowly and always sat at the front of the class. He wore dark-rimmed glasses without any glass. He wore a funny hat from the school's Lost and Found. He'd stay on the bus for hours when downtown, not really going anywhere, but was only riding around. Often the bus driver would drive 1 block further south just to drop Brad off right in front of his house. Brad told really great stories, mostly straight from thin air. These were stories of monsters and ghosts, stories that really could scare. When he moved away, we all were very sad, but the bus driver was really glad. Ted sat in every class way there in the back. It was better that way, so he wouldn't distract. Ted had no problems looking over everyone's head. "It's the ceiling that I really dread," according to Ted. He bumped his head, much too often. The school nurses all said, "Poor Ted has bumps on the top of his head." He ducked at every doorway, but still hid his head that way. Ted started wearing his helmet whenever he'd walk around. It saved him from lots of hurting. That's what he mostly found. No more bumping his head here and thumping his head there, even if he did have helmet hair. It was that color that didn't help, with that particular shade of red. No one ever called him Lollipop Head. All his friends call him LT instead. Marie is always way too noisy. Everyone will agree. That's why all the dogs run away from Marie. It's not really okay. You can hear Marie squealing from a mile away. The firemen come whenever they hear her shriek. It sounds like someone drowning in an icy creek. If you get her excited, put your hands on your ears. Her frantic shrieking is painful to hear. She's loud when she's mad, and she's even louder when sad. Marie's crying is enough to wake the dead. It can rattle the brains inside your head. The school windows were broken again. For other things she's also been blamed, but Marie couldn't have caused Jimmy's burst vein, the city's ruptured water main, or even that crashed airplane. Still, there's really no noise to compare. Some people complained about losing their hair. When Jenny fell down the stairs and her newest dress was torn, Ben was there with his taunting scorn. Whenever something wasn't okay, Ben seemed to say it every day. He would always say this snick, "It's better than a poke in the eye with a stick." He said it when Michael Beach choked on a peach and even swallowed a pit, when Tom Crocker was locked in his locker and there was nothing he liked about it, or when Charlie Hicks got struck with a brick. Ben always said, "It's better than a poke in the eye with a stick." When anything bad would happen, everyone expected to hear that from Ben. But when he got poked in the eye that way, there was nothing left for him to say. There was something about Tess. Everyone thought her hair was a mess. Hairstylists gave her lots of advice to comb the way it grows and twist the ends twice. Both her fine hair and thick hair always stayed unbound. When her hair stuck up, she tried gooping it down. Her hair was completely unbound. She always tried her best to stop it from becoming unwound. No one really wants to gossip or gab. It was hard not to notice that it now looks like a large crab. It was the glue and the bubble gum that did the trick. To some, her hair now looks stylish and slick, but makes other people run away quick. Caroline was late for school almost every day. She'd often be left behind when the school bus drove away. No one complained, it was just her way, and it only caused a minute or two delay. She would always be last and late for every class. Her teachers even started to ask, "Would you be so kind to help out and stay behind?" She always made up for being late. According to Caroline, being late wasn't always great, but why rush to then later just wait? No one noticed her around, but they always knew where she could be found. At the back of every class was her empty chair waiting for her to sit there. She would never lead and was always at the back of the line. To bring up the rear, that's what's expected from Caroline. When not expected to be there from the beginning, no one ever noticed when she went missing. She was dressed so nicely for the school portraits of her class. There was no one else left behind. As always, she was last. The camera was working well, as far as anyone could tell, but when they looked to see Caroline's picture there, all that was there was the empty school chair.